So this is fairing compound. Total Boat's Total Fair epoxy fairing compound. And what this does is it's a 50-50 mix. So you use the same amount of each of these. When you put them together, it starts to harden. Very similar to fiberglass hardener and resin. When you put them together, then the chemical reaction happens and it starts to harden. And what you do is you do equal amounts, you fold them together, you mix it up, and it makes this green color that you kind of see. And you use this and you spread it on the boat, and this fills in all the cracks and the voids and the pits that you have on the boat. You let it harden or cure for 24 hours, and then you come back and you sand it off. And you do that process about 50 times until you get sick of it and the boat is close enough. It's you know, it could always be faired out more. It could always be kind of you know, smoother or a perfect finish. But for this project, we're just continuing. We've done it, I don't know how many times I've done it, you know, on the different parts of the boat. And that's the kind of camouflage color that you've been seeing throughout this. So yeah, I just wanted to show you, you know, what I've learned. Again, this is the first time I was doing this, and so I've done it a few times. I've gotten rather good at kind of how much I need and the quantities and how to apply it. And I'll show you guys kind of the technique that I use. So you pop these things open. You can see I've used quite a bit amount. So what I do is I take a popsicle stick, and just to save on materials, I break the popsicle stick in half. These are your A's and your B's, so they just don't touch. Again, you could use 2 popsicle sticks, you don't need to. And then I just kind of take a little dab. I really don't need that much. This is kind of the last round that I'm doing. So I take a little dab, you know, about that amount. I smear that, set it over here. And I take the blue, and you just kind of roughly get the same amount. And so I smear that next to it, and I just kind of look at them, and if they're around the same size, I could just use a little bit more blue. Again, it's not a, you know, exact thing, just close. And then what I usually do is I take the popsicle stick and I try and combine them as much as I can with the popsicle stick, because if you try to combine them with your spatula or your trowel, it takes longer and it gets messier. And so your popsicle stick is already kind of messy. So you can just do a really rough mix with your popsicle stick until it gets a relatively consistent green color. You smear off as much as you can. Set this to the side. Don't put this in there. Do not mix the containers together. Always keep everything separate. So I toss this off to the side. Then you take your spatula, or your trowel or whatever you call it, and then you go back in and you really start mixing it. So the technique I use is just, I mean, anyone who does drywall knows kind of, you know, or mixes paint, right? I know this because I mix paint. You press and you smear downwards, and when you don't get any streaks, then you know it's mixed thoroughly. And you want to scrape the bottom. You want to scrape completely off of the spatula so you know that there's no streaks hiding in your spatula. So yeah, so that is our mixed compound. And what I typically do, since I use chipboard here, is I just rip off an old piece of chipboard like that. Smear that onto the chipboard. Make sure you have a hard edge to kind of clean your spatula off of. And then yeah, you take this and let's go to the boat. So the reason you do this 50,000 times is because of things continue to start appearing. And so as you can see, this has changed shape over the last, I don't know how many weeks that I've been fairing this boat. But since this is the last round, I'm just filling in final pockets. As I was cleaning the boat and doing the final sanding, some fiberglass chips started to fall off, some pit holes started to reveal themselves. So I'm just going back through with a final fairing coat. So we're just spot filling at this point. And the technique that I've, I guess, developed while doing this, and again, I wouldn't nothing I'm about to say I would recommend. There are probably much more skilled people than I who actually know how to make a boat completely perfect. That's what we're not here to do. We're here to make a boat that's super high quality, that feels, I'm not a boat builder, so I'm trying to do the best that I can. And in doing that, I'm learning these techniques from these masters and applying them onto this and making some edits where I'm like, okay, maybe I don't need to do 50 coats. Maybe I only need to do 25. And so the technique that I've learned is just to kind of be more generous than you think. So the reason I've learned this while I've been doing this project is because I was very conservative with how much fairing compound I was putting on the boat. And when doing that, you take a larger spatula and you run it from here to here and you pull down, and you're basically trying to remove as much fairing compound as you can. And the upshot of this is that it'll leave the fairing compound in the low spots, and you'll remove all of the high spots. And again, that works when you have the right tools and you have enough time to kind of do 50 coats. But what I was learning with this boat is especially with the technique that I'm showing here, you have to give yourself material to remove. Because what was happening when I was doing the 50 coat method and I was getting frustrated and I was just like, this is not working the way that they're saying it does, is because I was removing too much. I wasn't giving myself something to sand off. And so when I went back through, everything was still low and I had to do another coat. And I was just getting super frustrated because it was just coat after coat after coat and I wasn't seeing any progress. And the reason of that is because I was removing too much. And the reason I was removing too much is because everything you put on the boat, you have to sand back off because you're trying to sand off as much of this fairing compound as possible is the intent of doing this project or doing this part. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the boat completely smooth along this, this curve in every single direction. And to do that, if there's low spots or there's high spots, they're going to show up in the paint. And so you take a sanding board and you span the distance and you sand everything to the same height. So the technique that I've been using is to put more on than you think, and then kind of really just kind of go at it to get it to a spot that you're kind of happy with. And you'll still show up with some darker green spots through here. And then you just go back through. When you've finally gotten sick of it, you go back through with a smaller sanding block, and then you work your way down. So you start with a really long board, then you shrink down to a smaller long board, and then you shrink down to a sanding block. And then for the final little bits, if you're still like, man, this is not where I want it to be, with me, I was just knocking it down with my hand, which is not recommended. So again, this is not a master boat building class. This is just me sharing the things that I've learned along the process, and maybe you can apply them or develop them in your own projects. So this technique that I'm doing for this final kind of fill coat in some of these places is to put more on than you think that you need to fill the void. Because also what happens if you have little pockets or tiny little microscopic holes, and you really want to get them filled, what I've learned is if you do the scraping technique where you just fill enough to fill that hole and then you scrape it clean, absolutely clean, it'll pull all the fairing compound out of that hole. This is really good fairing compound, and yet it'll still pull it out of that hole because it's gooey. And as it starts to cure, it gets even more tacky and it will pull it out. So I usually build up a bit more. You can kind of see that in the locations that I've done. They're a bit built up pretty high. And again, I'm not recommending this, but what I've been doing, and we'll see if it works, and I'm sure it will, is I take the orbital, which you don't want to use the orbital on this. You want to do everything with a long board. I take the orbital and I knock down the excess, and then you have to be very careful that you don't sand a flat surface into it. But I knock down the excess, these little high peaks and everything. So instead of spending time and really kind of, you know, sand, and then eventually you get down to where you're actually supposed to be at, I take the orbital, I knock down the excess, then I go back through with a block and I sand it to where it needs to be. And you just have to be mindful and you have to be really vigilant about making sure you're not taking more off than you need. But yeah, this side is looking good. Again, I've been discovering as I'm sanding the boat and cleaning the boat, you know, I've been discovering these things. And here's an example over here about what I was talking about. So we'll zoom in here. And hopefully you'll be able to see this. So when I scrape this clean, you see that? I'll move a bit closer. Yeah. You see how this has pulled away from the hole, and then you put more on, and then you scrape it clean, and you can still see that it's pulling out of that cavity. Now I've prepped the surface, I've cleaned it, I've acetoned it, and it's still, you want to fill that cavity, or else you're going to go back through and you're going to sand everything, and there's still going to be those holes there, and then you'll have to go back through with another coat. So what I'm suggesting, and again, you know, this is probably not what people would tell you, is just build up, you know, fill it, go in every direction, fill the cavity, make sure there's no air pockets, and then just leave it a bit proud and scrape off as much excess as you can around your spot, but leave that area a bit proud. And what I have, you know, this is just, you know, painting techniques at this point, but what I've learned is that your first application is probably the best. You know, when you go through and you apply the fairing compound in one motion, usually that's the best. If it's not, then you go back through and you kind of like touch it up and do all the little details. But typically, you know, do this slowly, do your first application, and then take a step back and be like, okay, does that look good, or do I need to fiddle with it? Because as you fiddle with it, it's going to, you know, maybe cause some problems. But yeah, all of this on this side looks pretty good. So we're gonna move. And we're at the other side here. Again, this is the last coat. So what I'm applying here is just the tiny little pinholes that I've seen. I wasn't even gonna do this. The ones on this side are just, I wasn't even gonna do another fairing coat because I was just like, you know, things are probably good enough. But I was on the other side sanding it, and a rather large piece came off of the fiberglass because there was an air pocket in it because the fiberglass cloth that we put on had some. It was really tight weave, and it didn't allow air bubbles to penetrate through. And we continued to work it, but there were some places where there was air bubbles, and you have to chip those out. And you don't discover the air bubbles until until you've sanded and cleaned the surface. So yeah, anyways, long story short, there was a piece of fiberglass that I had to chip out because it was an air bubble. And so I had decided, I was like, okay, this will be the last one. And so since I was making it up anyways, I might as well, you know, do these tiny little microscopic fixes. Because these are fixes that I have already done, and they had just tiny little pinholes in them, and so I was like, well, those will be fine. Like right there, that's perfect. That's a perfect example of a couple pinholes that I filled. I left it a bit proud. I came back through, and it finished. And you can be as meticulous with this stuff as you want. You can spend, I mean, I have weeks, right? You can spend weeks doing and redoing this stuff. It's just not worth it to a certain extent, you know. And if I was a professional, if I was doing this for a living, I would probably have the right tools, the correct longboards, and, you know, a 5-gallon pail of this stuff to just slather the entire boat with. But for this project, you know, I've been learning and adapting and, you know, experiencing all parts of a of a boat building project. And that's really, you know, what this is. This is a case study for everything that is involved in in building a boat, which is just very cool. And it's on a smaller scale. I mean, it's a 14-foot boat, which is not a small boat by any means, but it's not like a it's not like a mega yacht. And I don't know how many people I've told this is the biggest I think I would go. This I think if I maybe a 16-footer. But you know, we can still, with 2 people, we can still lift this thing and rotate it. It's getting pretty heavy, but yeah, and it fits in the shop, which is important. But yeah, I think that is good. I think that's all I'm gonna do. So let me see if I can. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for tuning in and you know, coming along on the process. It's been a good time hanging out with you guys and, you know, doing this up. But yeah, if you have any questions, you know, leave them down in the comments. But yeah, again, you know, this is just the techniques and the things that I've learned along the process. They're not a master boat builder's techniques probably, but I've learned from them and adapted from them, and you know, brought and applied them to the project that I was working on, and perhaps he'll do the same. So yeah, best of luck to you guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.